Welcome back to the second part of the .NET MAUI Azure Pipelines video series. In the first part, we discussed building our Windows app on Azure DevOps. Whenever we get a trigger, which we set up whenever we push code to our production branch, then it kicks off a job, which firstly executes a step to set our .NET version according to the variables that we set in our library. We then install our MAUI workloads. Then we actually do our build for our Windows MAUI app. And finally, we published the artifact to Azure DevOps to be consumed by our release pipeline later on. So in this video, we'll be extending upon that and having a better look at the multi-tiered system that I mentioned in the previous video, where we have pipelines. Within pipelines, we can have multiple stages. Within the stages, we can have multiple jobs. And within the jobs, we can have multiple steps. Each job, however, spins up a new virtual machine. So you can say what OS to target on a stage, and that will apply automatically by default then to all the jobs in that stage. Or you can specify each job to have a different operating system virtual machine that it spins up. So we'll be using a Windows agent for both Android and our Windows jobs. And just to demonstrate how we can set dependencies between jobs, I'm going to show you how to set a dependency to say that we always want our Android job to only execute after our Windows job has completed. Since the setup steps will be exactly the same between both the Windows and Android jobs, I'll also show you how to set up a template to reuse that code so that we don't repeat ourselves. And then we'll be building and signing our Android app by generating the required Keystore file and using the secure files to sign that. So let's get started. All right, coming back to our pipeline script, currently we only have one job doing our Windows build, even though we don't mention the word job in here. We just said we want to be targeting Windows latest on the Azure pipelines and execute these steps. So it's executing as one job. So we want to start implementing our multi-tiered system. So if you start writing stages here, the autocomplete is not going to work correctly, even if you have Azure Pipeline selected. So just in case you missed that from the previous video, you should install the Azure Pipelines extension in VS Code, which allows you to have autocomplete on your YAML scripts and the linting as well. But if we type stages here, it doesn't give us the right recommendation, and it's because the indentation following it isn't correct. So all of this we need to indent a bit, and then we'll start getting the right autocomplete options. So we're going to have a couple of stages. The first one will be for our Android and Windows. So this is going to be called Windows and Android stage. And it will have a display name for Windows and Android stage. We want this to be running on the Windows latest virtual machine. So you can either have your pool as an Azure pipeline pool, which builds it on the Microsoft Azure cloud virtual machines, or you can have a self-hosted machine. So if you have a dedicated machine at your office that does these builds for you, then you get unlimited minutes even on the free plan, but you can only have one self-hosted machine doing builds for you on the free plan. So I'm just going to say here Azure pipelines, even though it does default to that, just to be explicit about it. And then inside our stage, we want multiple jobs. So the first job will be our Windows job, and that will have a display name of Windows job, and we want to be executing all these steps inside that job. So I'm just going to indent that a bit, and there we go. all these steps are now executed for our Windows job, and we have a single stage currently. So now we can copy all of this code for the Windows job to be a starting point for our Android job. So you can paste that, but you'll see the indentation is a bit broken. So you just have to fix that. There we go. Now we change this to call it Android job and change its display name to Android job as well. It will also be executing the set.NET version, the install MAUI workloads, and show current working directly exactly the same as the Windows job. So at this point, some bells will hopefully be kicking off, and you're like, this goes against the don't repeat yourself principle. So what we can do is we can use what is called a template. We're going to create another file and call it setuptemplate.yaml, and we're going to copy all the steps that we want executed in our setup template, which is set.NET version, install MAUI workloads, and show current working directory. We're going to paste it in here, and I'm also just going to set this as Azure pipeline so that my linting works. I'm just going to fix this indentation and save that. Now, instead of mentioning all these steps here, we can remove all of that, and instead we can say template and then just specify the file's name, which is setup_template.yaml. And we can copy that and do exactly the same thing on our Android job. There you go, that's much better. It already makes your file much smaller and makes it easier to spot any issues. So our build job is going to be called build Android MAUI app, and our CS project is still located in the same location, so we're going to leave that as is, but our framework has changed. So we're not targeting NET 8 Windows anymore, we're now targeting NET 8 Android. The configuration is still release, and the output, instead of the Windows subdirectory, I'm going to create Android. Technically that's not necessary since each job spins up its own VM instance and is a fresh working directory. Also just going to change my Windows build artifact step to instead say Android, publish Android app to artifacts, and it's also going to be in that subfolder, and I'm also going to call this artifact Android instead. So at this stage we're not signing our Android AAB or APK yet, but I think this is still a good point to push these changes to Azure just to see if everything is working correctly, if we're referencing our setup template correctly, if we're building our Android app correctly. So I'm going to commit and push these changes to Azure. So going to Azure, since we set up the trigger as our production branch, it kicked off a build automatically when we pushed these changes. And there you can see the Android job was added. Now you'll notice, even though the Windows job was mentioned first in our script, it still chose to execute the Android job first. And that's because we haven't set up any dependencies yet. So it just goes to show that if you don't put any dependencies, it can execute in any sequence. And here you can see, even though these steps we mentioned in a template file, it correctly put them in there and started executing them for our Android job. So going back to our script, we can set up a dependency to make sure that our Windows job always runs first before our Android job gets executed. And the way you can do that is adding a depends on. And you do add the square bracket so you can add multiple jobs that needs to be executed first before this one. But in this case, we only want our Windows job. So make sure you copy the name of the job and not the display name and paste it in there. That way, our Android job always execute after the Windows job's completion. Great, and here we can see our Android build has just completed in about 6.5 minutes. So the Android build does take quite a bit longer than our Windows build. So you might, if you're doing like a PR build or so, you might rather, if it's just a developer build and you're just testing basic logic, then you might rather want to test it on a Windows build. But ideally you want to test on all platforms that you're going to be deploying to. And we can see our Android app has published. And if we go to our artifacts and expand the Android app, you'll see it publishes an AAB and an APK, which is quite nice. We'll only need the AAB for our Google Play Store submission, but it is nice having an APK since you can actually install that on a phone and test it straight away. So if you have a tester in your team, they can download this APK from here and they can already start testing everything before you get to the deployment stage. So that is quite nice. Okay, so we've successfully built our Android AAB and APK from our .NET MAUI app and published the artifact to our DevOps artifacts. However, at this point, the AAB and APKs aren't signed yet. So signing is basically just a way that you say, look, I am the authority that's allowed to be able to push updates for this application. So even if someone somehow steals your credentials to log into Google Play Console, if they don't have the Keystore file to sign your Android application, then they won't be able to push a malicious update to that bundle ID. So if you already have a Keystore file, you can just go to DevOps in your library under the secure files and add your secure file. However, if you do not, you want to generate your Keystore file, you can do that firstly by just downloading the latest JDK, which is the Java Development Kit. So you can select your OS. So I'm on Windows, and then you can just download the latest 64-bit installer. So once you've downloaded and installed that, you can go to the location where it's installed, usually in Program Files Java. And I have, in my case, JDK 22. So you might already have JDK on your computer. However, you want to make sure you're doing this with one of the latest tools, since you might sometimes run into some oddities if you're using an old version of the keytool.exe. So that's essentially what we'll be using to generate our Keystore file. So going to the Microsoft Docs, I'll drop this link in the description below. But the document saying publish an Android app using the command line, they have a whole section on creating your Keystore file. And essentially it's this command that we want to run. So it basically uses that keytool.exe application, and you give it your alias.keystore name, provide the alias over there, and you also specify for how many days it should be valid. All right, so here they give us a good example. So you can have, if your alias is my app, then they fill it in for you. Okay, so we're just gonna copy this command that they provide us here as a starting point, and then we can open command prompt. So then we want to navigate to our JDK's install location in the bin folder and drag our keytool.exe in here so that we're sure it's using this latest version of the keytool in case you have more than one installed. And then we want to paste the command that we copied from Microsoft. So now we're mentioning this twice, so let's just remove that. And then we can just change our parameters. So wherever there's my app, you can just provide your own alias. .keystore, and the same for the alias. And we can leave the rest as is. If we press enter, it's going to prompt you for a password, While you're typing, nothing's going to change, but it is recording your keystrokes. Your password needs to be at least 6 characters in length. I'm going to prompt you again. And then it's going to ask you a couple of questions. I'm just going to leave these as unknown for now. And then it's going to ask you, is everything correct? So you just have to type yes. And then it generates your Keystore. So you can just do an Explorer dot to open Explorer, your Windows Explorer in that location. And there is our Keystore file. So you want to take this and then upload that into our secure files on Azure DevOps under the library under secure files. So let's just click on the plus. We can drag our Keystore file in here and we can say OK. And there we go. Our Keystore file has been successfully uploaded. Going back to our pipeline script, we want to add 2 additional steps in here to, first of all, download our Keystore that we've uploaded, and then to copy it into the same location as the CS branch. And then finally, we want to update our .NET publish command with a couple of extra parameters to actually sign our app with that Keystore file. So the first step that we're looking here at is the download secure file at 1, since it's version 1 of the task. We can give it a name. We can give it a display name for this step and give it some inputs. So as an input called secure file, and then we just have to specify the name exactly as it's mentioned on Azure DevOps. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to copy it from here just to make 100% sure I'm not making a typo. There we go. Now we've added the step to download our Keystore file. So the next step is called copy files, and that we'll be using to just copy it into the same location as our CS proj. So I'm going to add another task in here called copy files, and we're going to use the latest version, which is version 2. And we'll also provide a display name over here. It's going to say import secure file, and it also has some inputs. So the first one is the source folder, and the location where this step imports or downloads the file is called agent temp directory, which is a standard Azure variable, Azure Pipelines variable. So you can get that by specifying $, and then inside brackets we can just say agent.temp directory. And then the contents that we want to copy is this file. And then we have a target folder where we want to be copying this Keystore file to, which is the location of our CS proj. So I'm going to copy this first part over here. And there we have it. So it's now downloading our secure file. It's copying it to the exact same location as our CS proj. So going back to the Publish an Android app using the command line document and scrolling down, we can see a bunch of parameters mentioned here. So every time you add this -p, it writes something into your CS proj. So you could have specified a lot of these things already in your CS proj, but it's not considered best practice since you would be exposing your password for your Keystore on your Git history, and that's not something we'd like to do. So by doing it this way, it injects these parameters at build time, and it even hides it. Even when you look at the actual build logs, then it will show a couple of asterisks instead of actually displaying your password. We currently have everything up until the configuration, and we've also set an output location. So we want to be copying all the rest of this to our script, and we can paste that right at the end. And then we just need to specify a couple of things in here. So we're saying, yes, it needs to be signed with a Keystore. the Keystore's file name is, in my case, appalchemy.keystore. In my case, my alias is the same name as my Keystore file's name. So I'm going to paste that in there. So instead of specifying our password in plain text here, we'll be using a secret variable that we're going to create. So I'm going to call it keystore underscore password, and also going to add it there. So you can specify the same password for both of these parameters. And there we have it. So we will have everything we need to actually sign our AAB and APK at this point. So we'll just need to add that password to the Azure DevOps variables. So going back to the variables and go to our library, under the variable groups, go into our variable group, and then we can specify our Keystore password. So pasting that in there to make sure I'm not making a typo. And then there's a little lock over here that allows you to say that this is a password and no one should be able to see this again. We can only use it in the pipelines. So I'm going to click there, and then I'm going to write my password, and I'm going to click save. Don't want my browser to save that. Great, so our password's been set up, so it's finally ready to sign our Android app. So I'm going to push these changes to the server. You can see our new steps there and the additional parameters that we added. Committing and pushing this to production, which will kick off our production build automatically since we set that trigger. We go to the pipelines, you'll see it's paused, and that's because it still needs permission to our new secure file that we added. So if we go to view, it says it needs permission to appalchemy.keystore, so I'm going to have to say permit, and there we go. So because we explicitly said that our Android job should now depend on the Windows job's completion, the Windows job will always execute first. Great, so here we can see that it's starting our Android job. So the first thing you'll see is a pre-job for the download Keystore file, and certain tasks are automatically set as pre-jobs, which essentially just means that the pipeline will try and execute those tasks first before actually starting sequentially moving through your script. So that way it always ensures that the Keystore is already downloaded and ready before executing your script. It then checked out our pipeline and executed the 3 steps in our setup template, and it then imported our secure files correctly by copying that downloaded Keystore file into the same location as our CS proj, and then it executed our publish command. And if you have a look here, it is obfuscating our password as well as our alias. So because we set the password as a secure variable, it chooses to obfuscate that password for us here, so that even if someone has access to view these pipelines, they can still not retrieve your Keystore password. Great, so we can see our Android app as built successfully and signed our artifacts. So if we go into the published artifacts, the ones that say -signed are actually now signed with our Keystore file. So well done on getting it to this point. These artifacts are now ready to be released to the appropriate store. But before we get to building our release pipelines, in the next video, I will first show you how to build and sign your iOS IPA artifact by doing our .NET MAUI build on a Mac OS virtual machine. And from there on out, we can then finally get to our release pipelines. So be sure to hit the like and subscribe button so that you don't miss out on the next videos. See you next time.